I don't think so. I really don't believe that if you go down to Sao Paulo and Rio Grande do Sul and Paraná, or you go to the west and you, Brazil doesn't show signs really of imploding. I think the tragedy will be not taking advantage of the opportunity and providing for what has happened continually in Brazil. You know, I can't help but remember that when I first went to Brazil, the income per capita in Brazil was something of the order, I guess it was 3 times the per capita income in South Korea. And nowadays, the income per capita in South Korea is 2 to 3 times the income per capita in Brazil. And the tragedy will be an inability to move up the ladder, an inability to build in this productivity change on a continuing basis, which is necessary, and to recognize that you have to become much more efficient, and you have to be able to adapt more effectively. So that's what I want to say about implosion. Secondly, what will decide the vote? I think what will decide the vote is not the Bolsa Familia group. What will decide the vote is the Class C. It's where the 35 to 40 million increase has occurred in terms of income of people who are just above Bolsa Familia, who have just moved up. And in that group, who are committed to more consumption, to buying more automobiles, to going more into debt, because one of the things that we know in Brazil, which is really troublesome, is that you've got something of the order of 25% each year of income has to be spent on repaying the debt that people have accumulated this year. And that's a very high percentage in order to keep the economy going. But it's that Class C, and it's that Class C which ultimately can't keep consuming that way. And that's the problem, because the new government, if it's going to be effective in altering the situation, has to somehow get domestic savings higher. And it won't get domestic savings higher merely from having more efficient taxation and taxing the rich more effectively. It's also going to have to cut down on the amount of constant increases in consumer credit that's available to encourage people to consume. The third thing, in terms of, I have here a note, and I don't understand what I wrote. I have here the dynamics of the market. I guess speaking of financial markets, and the way in which financial markets react. You just look at the stock market and you know what the results of a recent poll has been in the case of Brazil, and that is because there is so much uncertainty because you've appreciated the exchange rate in Brazil, and Brazil is very expensive. I can tell you, I was just down there last week. And it costs more to have a meal in a restaurant in Brazil than it costs to have one in New York City. And it's the case that the markets are really very uncertain, and the clear advantage will be once things sort themselves out and you're able to begin to get a devaluation, which is indeed necessary for Brazil, for the export sector. And finally, on class and race, I will just simply point out, I think the racial issue hasn't really at all surfaced and hasn't really been part of the discussion. And nor has the one of women. The nature of the debate is really a different one. And that's to Brazil's credit, and reflects the fact that the racial and women's issues are not at the center of what's going on. The politics and the economics are.
That's great. Do you have anything to add?
No, I think it's, I want to say one thing about the question of the politics. I agree the politics is super important. It would be great if Brazil could create fast and a more sane political system. But in spite of that, look at Brazil between 1990 and 2008. There was a lot done with the crazy parliament, with the numbers of ministers and everything. We got a lot done. Like the numbers on education that you showed, but you can see very similar numbers in a lot of other things. You know, Brazil has better education. We have the social programs that are established, like the Bolsa Família and so on. But by the way, it's an incredibly inexpensive program, so there's no reason to cut Bolsa Família, because Bolsa Família have to set GDP. You know, there's a state that collects about 35% of GDP, spends 0.5% on Bolsa Família. That's a trivial amount for the expense of the state. And the third thing is that I think Brazil, commodity boom helped, but was a minor part of this whole story. If you look at Brazil and you see what Brazil has achieved in many areas, you know, first Brazilian companies, you know, how efficient and well-run some of the largest companies in Brazil are. That's why you open up the newspaper and see Burger King bought by a Brazilian company. Then you open the next day, is ketchup. Heinz is bought by a Brazilian company. Now, Chiquita banana is like one of the symbols of American imperialism. They're going to be sold to a Brazilian company. So there's a large number of very efficient businesses in Brazil. Many of them are not even involved. It's true about the Chiquita banana company, but the other companies are not at all involved in commodities. They're just companies that know how to make things. Embraer knows how to make things. It's almost impossible to take a plane, local plane in the U.S. or in Europe and not be built by Embraer. So there's a lot of things that Brazil has been able to do, which are orthogonal to the commodity boom, and happen in this political environment. So although I would think it would be great, all of a sudden we had three parties, very ideological, with a very clear idea what they want to do. We had 12 ministers and so on. That would be amazing for Brazil. I think it's very hard to happen, and I think we're going to have to figure out how to grow the same way we grew and do things well, the same things we did between 1990 and 2008.
I was thinking about the movements of June 2013, and what was the meaning of that? I think there was a desire of a welfare state, to create a welfare state in Brazil. And the question is how to create a welfare state in Brazil if we have such economic problems. And that's not easy to solve. So that's why I agree with Fischer that Brazil will not be destroyed, it will not implode, but I think that we will have turmoil, social, political turmoil, because democracy is making its own way in Brazil. People want to participate, people want to take part of everyday life of the government and so on. And in a certain way, people do not feel represented anymore in the Congress or by the government. So it's a complicated political question. And I would say...
We're kind of running out of time.
Okay.
Like, if she has to talk, we need to cut time.
No,
but if you have something to say, just to be
only
brief.
to say that Gustavo and other people asked for.
Yeah,
Marina is able really to, it's much more difficult for Dilma to win against Marina than it would be against Aécio Neves. Because Marina is black and white, she belongs to the people, she came from Amazon, and so the votes that would be secure for Dilma won't anymore. That's the question, that's the interrogation.
Okay, you have the last
3
one.
minutes to say a lot of things. Class and race. I agree that it hasn't really been a factor in this election. And well, class isn't, race isn't. I mean, race is really not particularly politicized in Brazilian politics. Is a sort of an interesting discussion about historically why that's the case. I could see if Marina wins to try and change that. But she hasn't run as a black candidate in the same way that these two women have not run as women candidates. And someone like Michelle Bachelet in Chile certainly made being female part of her campaign, and that has not happened with any of the female candidates in the last several elections. The private sector in the future. One thing I will say is I agree that the markets do well at predicting the outcome of elections, but in my experience in Brazil, they seem to do rather poorly at predicting the subsequent economic policies. You look at the market reaction to Lula in 2002, I tell my students, if you want to make money, be a currency speculator when a moderate leftist is running for office in Latin America. The real went from like $2.20 to over $4, over the course of that campaign, and then guess what? Lula turned out to not be a communist in disguise, right? And so, on the flip side, they're rallying around Marina, but is Marina really going to be as friendly to the markets as the markets seem to think? I don't think that's entirely something that we can read off of what the Bovespa is doing. Deciding constituency, I would keep an eye on the evangelicals, as I've said. Classe C, absolutely. I mean, any group that's 40 million people, right, as both of these are, can potentially decide the election, and one that's as close as this. Yeah, and overlap, right? And sort of, it's a difficult question to answer because if it's a close election, any decently sized group could have decided it. Where will Brazil go beyond? I think on the positive side, we're seeing, on the one hand, it's a sort of two-party competition at the presidential level. And, on the other hand, in 2002, you had 4 candidates. Gavechinha was in the mix, and Ciro Gomes. In 2006, you had Luiza Lena as a sort of a dissident from the PT who got 6-7% of the votes. Marina getting 19% in 2010. Marina running as a strong candidate now. You're getting more competition. I think that's a healthy thing. Whether this emerges to constitute a third sector is something to keep an eye on. I'm less convinced about it. But I will suggest that there may be more disillusionment and potential for these sorts of protests that we saw last year if Marina wins. And governs the way that you govern in Brazil, which is kind of politics as usual. And the reason I would suggest that is, there's a lot of excitement around her candidacy, and I don't think that any president is going to disillusion some of their supporters. What the PT had was a history, social movement base, ties to unions, people that were not going to abandon the PT even when they upset them. And something I will always recall from my dissertation fieldwork in 2006, interviewing one of the Cuchi leaders, the Union Confederation, and telling me how unhappy he was with the Lula government's economic policies, and then saying, but when Lula went up there and walked into the governing palace, it was like he was doing that on behalf of the working class, and no matter what happens with the corruption and the governing policies, like I will never turn against him because of where he came from and who he represents, right? And so, Marina has a personal history, a compelling personal history, right? And Lula had a compelling personal history, but but the PT also had a compelling movement history, and Marina doesn't have that in the same way. right? And so I think that the PT actually has got its supporters to put up with quite a bit without really going out into the streets until 2013, right? And I would not predict that Marina would last that long. So sorry to end it on a negative.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming.